Welcome to the Superhuman Minds YouTube channel. I'm Britt Brogaard.
I'm Christian Marlow.
Hi.
Hey. So this week I thought we could talk about grief. Somebody close to me in my family tragically passed away last week, kind of just totally unexpectedly, and so our family and is kind of people feel different ways about it and dealing with it different ways. And so I was thinking that this week we might talk about the grieving process and how it can differ among individuals.
Yeah. So it does differ a lot among individuals. So there's the 5-stage model of grief, of course, which is classical, which involves not necessarily in that order, but denial, sadness, anger, bargaining, and then finally acceptance. I thought that is probably true of many cases, that if they do involve those 5 stages. I thought about the one thing that's missing from that model, if you start with that model as a starting point, is the element of surprise.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, you can grieve when you don't have surprise. So you can obviously have grief when you know that something is going to happen, right? So you don't always have surprise in there. But in this case, the case you described to me before we started, there was obviously an element of surprise because it was a sudden death. Likewise, when people unexpectedly break up from a relationship, right, where they didn't expect it, they didn't see it coming, there's an element of surprise. But there are obviously different ways that people grieve. So these are just sort of a standard model of grief. And maybe you could tell me a little bit about the differences you have experienced in people's ways of grieving.
Well, I definitely think that surprise is an element that's a little different from denial, because as far as denial goes, I think in one sense that category kind of means that you aren't necessarily realizing how your life's going to be different now.
Yeah.
Versus, I think the element of surprise, at least in my case, when I was kind of reflecting over the last week about this person, I was kind of Googling online and reading his bio about his life and learned some new things I didn't know about him, and particularly like what exactly he does for his job. And the first thing that crossed through my mind was like, oh wow, I need to talk to him about this. This is like what I'm really interested in. And then I realized kind of while I'm thinking that I can't. And so then it kind of would set in again that person is gone. And I think that when it's unexpected death, I think that's the hardest part, is kind of suddenly not having prepared to not be able to call a person or talk to them, or that they're not going to contribute anything new.
Right.
So,
right.
But then I also think that sometimes you don't reach all the stages. So I think that people don't always reach the stage of acceptance. I think that stage is kind of thrown in there as it's going to one day be, you'll kind of move on. But I think in like very tragic deaths, like murders and things, where it just was a wrongful death, I think that people sometimes never reach acceptance.
Yeah, and the time it takes to get to that point. I mean, there are cases where people finally reach acceptance when, in states, for instance, where they have the death penalty, right? So they go as a kind of closure. Like if they had a kid that was murdered, for example, they go watch that, and then and other people deal with it by forgiveness. So they need to, in the end, they just need to forgive and say it to the person. And you think, like, how could they do that? How can they sit there and tell the child's murderer that they are forgiving the person? But there are people who need to do that in order to come to some kind of closure, if not full acceptance of the death, I think.
And I know you talk a bit about it in your love book.
Yeah, Unromantic Love.
Unromantic Love, where you, in the sense of love, there's kind of a whole grieving process for, when you break up from a long-term, sometimes even short-term relationships.
Yeah.
How does that differ from death, or is it a pretty similar kind of cognitive process?
I think it can be very similar. So there may be, again, that may or may not be the element of surprise because you might have seen it coming. And might still be grieving your relationship, your lost relationship. There's probably, if there's an element of surprise, there might also be an element of denial that's longer, because in that case of, if it's a relationship as opposed to a death, there is the chance, right? There is actually realistically the chance that you could get back together with the person. So you could be in denial for a lot longer, in the sense that you might be thinking, oh, it's just a phase they're going through, or oh, that's just they just need a break. They just need to breathe a little bit. And so I think the denial process could be a lot longer. And then when you know that the person's not coming back, you're probably not sort of denying it to the same extent or in the same way. I also think that maybe the anger might be stronger and longer in the case of a breakup, because, or can be anyway, because if it's death, and you have certainly the dead person, right? You might feel angry at the dead person because they died, but you're probably not going to go on feeling angry. You're probably going to feel more sad about it. And if it was a wrongful death, then you might be angry at the person who did or caused the death. But in the case of a breakup, the person, if it's, let's say you have been broken up with, right, and it came as a surprise to you, and it's not something you wanted, then you're going to be angry because the person is still out there, right? So, and they decided to end it. The same if you lose a job, I can imagine in many cases. In some cases, it might be no one's fault, because someone might be forced to, for financial reasons, to just cut some lines or whatever. But in cases where you get fired for something you did, you might also have a kind of anger because it's something that is someone's fault. Whereas in many cases of death, there is no fault, right? If it's death from aging, you can't really say it's anyone's fault that they die. So I think that the anger could be potentially longer in some cases. Certainly also in some cases of death, but also in some cases of breakups.
Do you think you can grieve when it is your fault, when you know it's your fault? So if you're the person who does the breaking up, can you still go through a grieving process even though you caused it?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question, because then the question becomes whether the feeling perhaps is more like regret, right? If you actually if you're not in denial about who caused it anyway. So if you really think you did something and then you got fired from your job, you took money out of your boss's purse. So you took a couple $1,000 out of your boss's purse, and she caught you and fired you on the spot, and you're not in denial about that. I think that could probably still be grief. I mean, you might have regret that you did it. That could be some of the stages of grief, I think, because you might grieve it's not the action you did wrong that you're grieving in this case, but the loss, right? So you might still grieve the way that you lost your colleagues, You lost let's say your office, your nice office. You lost your nice health benefits. And they can see that you could grieve that even though it's your fault. Mm-hmm. And certainly I think that in the case of relationships, you could also grieve. Or death, right? If let's say that you go out and you murder someone mm-hmm. because you have a hissy fit, and maybe it's not like a planned murder, right? But it's like maybe it's a spontaneous murder, but then afterwards you grieve the loss of the person. I think. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that was definitely the case with remember Andrea Yates, that woman who had, terrible postpartum depression and probably some other kind of psychotic disorders, and she murdered her multiple children. But it was clear that she was, completely distraught over it. Even almost the moment after she did it, then she kind of came to and I believe she had lined all the children up on the bed like they were sleeping and called the police. And of course, at the time, she was convicted, and then they had a whole appeal process, and now she's in a mental facility. But so I think there's definitely situations where you can cause the grief. So that's
definitely that's a very good example of that.
How about do you think you can be grieving but not know it, not be aware that you're grieving, or is it something that you have to be kind of conscious of when you're doing it?
I have the opinion that emotions can occur below the level of conscious awareness. Mm-hmm. So I definitely think that you could be grieving without feeling it, in the sense that you're not conscious of you're grieving, or you might misinterpret. Maybe you are conscious of some of the feelings, but you misinterpret them. You might maybe go around grieving sort of unconsciously mostly, or you might be having all of this anger and sadness, but maybe something else happened such that you're attributing the anger to that. So your computer broke down, and so you feel really angry, but then you find out, oh wait, it's not because of my computer broke down and I lost my documents that I'm angry. I'm actually angry because of this person died. So I think that so you can misinterpret your feelings, and you can also you could also just not be aware of them. I think that that's entirely possible. And I think that what people have in some of those cases is a kind of numbness. So the numbness is not the pain that goes along with the sadness or the slight negativity that goes with say the denial process, which I'm saying slight negativity because when you're in denial, it can feel better than if you're not in denial, right? But I think that that you could feel numb, just numb. Or not feel anything. Right. You could feel perfectly normal, and then you could be grieving under that. Underneath your conscious awareness. What do you think about that?
I think it's definitely the case, and so I think there's some implications for kind of how you conduct your behavior during the time you're grieving, right? I think it's important if something that should trigger a grieving process occurs, then you kind of have to try to be more self-aware and be more self-aware and reflect on how you're acting and question, is that because I really am, I took this action because I really believe that was the right thing to do, or if maybe I am not, my judgment's different right now because I'm undergoing this grieving process. But I guess the question is how you would do that, or are there any techniques for trying to speed through the grieving process, or kind of recognizing different symptoms?
Certainly there's, it's important, I think, to be aware of the grief. So obviously, if you're suppressing your grief, so your body or your brain will process the grief, but you're not aware of it. You don't really live through it. Whenever something occurs to you, maybe it's not completely unconscious, but that you're grieving. But whenever it occurs to you, you just sort of hurry up, and then you do a lot of work, or you go out drinking, or you go out partying, or something, so that you don't have to think about it. I think that's. Actually, it has been proven that it's a good thing to do it right after you experience something traumatic. So if you experience something traumatic, there's actually some evidence that you should go out and get completely drunk, because you're less likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder later on. But you shouldn't continue doing that, right? So that might be fine for a day or two, and then at some point you have to really live through it, because it's just gonna take longer if you don't live through those stages. And of course you may not have those stages. That's also a possibility. But if most people do have some anger and some sadness and some denial and so on, and I think it's important to allow yourself to really live through those emotions. And however you deal with sadness, right? So some people cry it out, until they're done. And then I think that's another way to deal with the grief when you get a little further along in the process. I think that it's important to restrict the grief so you can't go on grieving forever. It's just not feasible, especially not if it's so strong that it prevents you from doing your job or take care of your family or something. So, you might grieve, but you can't really go through the emotions forever. So it may help to schedule sessions with yourself. So you schedule some sessions with yourself where you allow yourself to grieve every day. So at a convenient time where you say, okay, so for this half hour or an hour or however long you need, I will really go through those emotions. If it's a person who died or a person who broke up with you, I'll think about the person, and if I feel sad, I'll feel sad, and if I feel angry, I feel angry. But then you sort of move on, and then whenever a thought then occurs to you during the day, you write it down and save it for your session with yourself. It could also be a session with a family member, of course, but it could also be a session with yourself if you don't have a family member close to you. So then you write it down during the day, and then you take it up. Everywhere, if you have a question you want to ask yourself or a family member, you write it down, and then you bring it up during your session that you have scheduled. So that's one way to deal with it. It's a common way to deal with obsession and compulsion. Once you get further along in the treatment of OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, you end up doing less and less of it. But if you really need to do some kind of, let's take the classical case where you have to wash your hands all the time, you allow yourself to do that, but not most of the day. At some point, you're down to maybe only doing it at a certain time during the day, right? So I think that grief could be dealt with in a similar way. Or you could cut down slowly. There's another method that you could use, and just cut down slowly on the amount of time you actually spend grieving, because grieving is something you do need to do, but some people can also almost become addicted to grief and can grieve for much longer than is practical, right? If they need to live their lives as well.
And so that person should probably see a therapist.
Yeah. At that point, you might want to get a therapist if it's not. Right.
And I know some people who temporarily relied on antidepressants and other medication to help them kind of get over that hump, and then they later on stop taking it. Yeah. So it's definitely something one can do is to get an antidepressant. It may be more anxiety you're feeling, so different people, of course, feel different things. Some people feel depression, some people feel anxiety, but
but the SSRIs work for both. So that's something that you could do to get through it if you can't get through it on your own. So if you have complicated grief, so grief that extends past a certain time period, so relative to what happened, of course, right, and relative to how close you were to the person. But yeah, so that's something one could do. Okay, anything else?
I think we had a good talk about this.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll talk to you next week, and in the meantime, you can look at the Superhuman Minds book, where we talk about the brain and all its functions.
All right.
All right.
See you next
Take
week.
care. Bye.
Bye.